friends, I'm Denise Carey, and my presentation today is called Two Outcomes of the Same Design, Classroom Management and Student Engagement in Critical Educational Psychology. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through why I think these two things, management and engagement, aren't actually separate problems at all. So my whole research project starts with something that I noticed as a guest teacher. I noticed that when I have full access to the lesson plan and the actual assignments a class is working on, that two things tend to happen at once. Behavior gets smoother and participation gets richer. Management and engagement rise together. When that access is missing, the opposite happens, and I disengage right alongside my students. So that pattern keeps showing up every time I guest teach, and it made me want to find a theory that actually explains it. So here's my thesis. Management and engagement aren't sequential problems you solve one after the other. They're two outcomes of the same conditions a teacher designs, and neither one causes the other. The shared root between the two is design quality. And that reframes the whole question from controlling students to shaping the conditions they're learning in. I'll be organizing this presentation around three main questions. Which theories actually connect management and engagement? When does motivation work emancipate students, and when does it quietly constrain them instead? And what ideological assumptions are baked into how we talk about engagement in the first place? These three questions come from Stephen Vassallo's book called Critical Educational Psychology, and his framework runs through everything I'm about to say. The default account, which is behaviorism. In this view, engagement just means observable compliance, and management is reinforcement, rewarding what the institution wants and discouraging what it doesn't. Vassallo points out that teachers using this approach need to be equipped with the principles of behaviorism, and that's not an accident. It ties motivation and management into one single task. The problem is, this produces what Vassallo calls a performance orientation. Students act to earn a reward or dodge a penalty. A quiet room gets mistaken for an engaged mind when really, management has just been reduced to contingency control. Let's move on to the next theory. Self-determination theory locates engagement somewhere else entirely, in whether a classroom meets students' needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. A large study on this found autonomy was the single strongest predictor of classroom engagement. But here's the important nuance. Engagement alone is not enough. It has to translate into higher quality motivation, motivation that's intrinsic rather than compliant, or it doesn't actually reach achievement. That distinction, intrinsic value versus external compliance, becomes the hinge my whole argument turns on. So what does the evidence actually show about management itself? A large multi-level study of secondary students found that activating instruction and classroom management were the two strongest predictors of engagement, and that they worked together, not against one another. The relationship was, in the author's words, substantial and practically meaningful. Management in this account isn't a control strategy. It's part of the design that supports learning. This next study flips a common assumption. Instead of students needing to arrive already motivated, a diary study found that teacher engagement predicts student motivation, both individually and at the group level. The more engaged the teacher, the more motivated the students. So that means we need to be passionate about what we're teaching. And that same study tied this directly to management. Since more experienced teachers showed stronger skills in classroom management, relationship building, and lesson design all at once. So, if design conditions can produce real engagement, here's the harder question. Can those same conditions just be a more convincing form of control? Vassallo argues that motivation work is often about rendering students amenable to institutional lessons. In the strongest version of this logic, A masterful teacher convinces students that they're autonomous choosers, even while regulatory mechanisms stay firmly in place. So perceived autonomy isn't necessarily the opposite of control. It can sometimes be the most effective form of it. Universal design for learning is the clearest counterexample I found. It shifts responsibility for struggle away from the student and onto the materials and methods themselves. Multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression build access from the start rather than waiting for the student to struggle first. This isn't just a teaching strategy. The researchers tie it explicitly to social justice, eliminating systemic exclusion before it happens. Structure by itself doesn't guarantee engagement. A flipped classroom study found students had near total control over their own pacing, but less than half felt they had adequate interaction with instructors or peers. Structure without activating instruction falls short. And importantly, the benefits of good design aren't selective. They show up across student backgrounds, which means designing for the margins genuinely helps everyone in the middle too. Here I want to complicate my own argument a little. Vassallo warns that labeling thinking as higher order or lower order is a binary, and it hides its own values and norms. Lower order work, like memorization and recall, aren't worthless. Bloom himself saw it as necessary groundwork for problem solving and critical analysis. So compliance and liberation aren't clean opposites. Sometimes routines scaffold autonomy instead of suppressing it. So why does practice keep drifting back toward control, even when teachers know better? A study of Moroccan classrooms found that structural constraints, not teacher attitudes, were the real barrier to learner autonomy. One teacher put it plainly: their educational autonomy was limited, and they couldn't explore approaches beyond what was already mandated. Another study in Ghana found nearly identical pressures. Inadequate training, standardized testing, and thin institutional support kept pulling teachers back toward the same default. There's an ideology underneath all this too, and that's meritocracy. The idea that outcomes come down to individual effort, full stop, regardless of the conditions a teacher builds. Even growth mindset, which sounds progressive, gets complicated by the research. One recent study found mindset beliefs about math ability don't actually help unless teachers back them up with ground-oriented classroom practices. So even a belief we credit entirely to the student turns out to depend on conditions around them. So in a nutshell, you have my whole thoughts right here. Vassallo defines management as the intentional organization of environmental conditions meant to shape action towards a purpose. Well, that's my theory basically in his words. But he also warns that even careful design can be just a more palatable way of securing compliance. So the real distinction isn't whether a teacher manages a room, it's what that management is designed to accomplish. Which brings me back to where I started. When I have access to lesson plan and the assignments, order and engagement show up together. Not because I'm managing students into behaving, but because I'm managing what I can actually see. And engagement follows from there. Take away that access, and disengagement and disorder show up together too. Not as two problems, but as one. The question was never whether a teacher manages a classroom. It's what that management is built to do. My sources are listed here for anyone who wants to dig further into the research behind this argument. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and I appreciate any feedback you have.